Hey everybody, welcome to Poor Decisions presented by Sip Kentucky. For those of you guys who are newer, my name's Steven. I'm the general manager at Sip Kentucky. We're one of the bourbon tour companies here in Kentucky. We're based out of Louisville, and we just kind of want to provide like a laid back breakdown about Kentucky culture, bourbon, experiences, food, stories that you get to experience along the bourbon trail. And it's kind of just bourbon and conversations at full strength, just like I enjoy my bourbon. So today we're going to do a little bit of a different episode than what we've done in the past. What I'd like to do is highlight two distilleries. And one of them is going to be a large brand that I'm sure everyone here is going to be familiar with. One of them is going to be a smaller craft brand that you might not be as familiar with, but they have a great history, a great story, and provide great experiences as well as products. So, I'm going to be drinking some of the things from both of these distilleries today. One of the distilleries is going to be Buffalo Trace. The other one is going to be right across the street, and it's J. Mattingly 1845. So, from Buffalo Trace today, I'm drinking one of probably my favorite product that they make, which is the Weller Antique 107. And then on the J. Mattingly 1845 side, I've got um, their Bourbon 31, which Bourbon 30 is like their flagship brand. It's the most common thing probably the easiest to find in your area is Bourbon 30. It's a great product. Their Bourbon 31 was a release they had for Halloween this year for October 31st. And then I've also got Poor Decisions from J. Mattingly 1845, which is a really cool bottle that I'll discuss a little bit when we get into them. But I'd like to start the day by discussing Buffalo Trace a little bit with you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the distillery, as well as some of the experiences they have, some of their products, some of the people who meant a lot to that brand and that distillery. And then we're going to kind of do the same thing for J. Mattingly 1845. So hang tight. We're going to have a great episode today. So, distilling at the site where Buffalo Trace is now has been happening since before America was even a country. So, Buffalo Trace is the longest continuously running distillery in the nation, and it kind of makes sense that their history it starts a really long time ago. So, it's located in what's now Frankfort, Kentucky. Same for J. Mattingly 1845. And Frankfort, Kentucky is our state's capital. Um, and when Buffalo Trace, when that location was first starting with the distilling, it was called Leestown. And Leestown was a little like frontier town that was set up by the surveyors. So you had Willis and Hancock Lee, who were surveying the area, and they essentially set up their own township kind of right across the river from Frankfurt. And that was Leestown. And it was it was kind of the Wild West back then. So we're talking about the late 1700s at this point, and Kentucky was west of the Appalachian Mountains, and essentially everything west of the Appalachian Mountains was the Wild West. Our big settlements were all east of the Appalachian Mountains in between the Atlantic Ocean and the Appalachian Mountains because the people who were funding these settlements were all over in Europe. And so it was kind of the closest places for everyone to land. There was plenty of land, plenty of food, plenty of space for everybody. So there wasn't a rush to push further west. But as we get towards the late 1700s, there is an interest in like what's out there and wanting to settle more, people wanting more land, more power, all those kinds of things. So with this being kind of the Wild West at the time, we had a lot of native animals that you won't see today. One of which being the American bison or buffalo is a term you would know today. And where this distillery is located and where Leestown was set up is right at a big bend in the Kentucky River. And the Kentucky River is a really large, really long river. At some points, there's these limestone cliffs kind of on either side, and they can be anywhere from like 20 to 100 plus feet tall. So it's not a great place to cross when you have those limestone cliffs. When there's this really sharp bend in the river, it creates a like a gentle slope on either side where people and animals can cross. And when there were these American bison in the area, they would migrate north and south with the seasons, and they would need to cross this river. When you have millions of bison crossing the river in the same point, they end up leaving their mark. More than just a couple footprints, it kind of leaves a scar on the earth. And this scar would be a trail that the bison would cross year after year after year. And then as settlers were coming into the area, they would cross in that same path because it was the path of least resistance. Um, this this trail, the scar, when it was put on the survey maps at first in the Leestown area, it was written down as the Buffalo Trace. And trace is a name that's synonymous with trail. So it's essentially saying this is the path that the buffalo walk through and we can see it. And that's what they wrote on their map. So years later, when the Sazerac company buys what's now the Buffalo Trace Distillery and they're looking to rename it, they find these old survey maps that have this big section on what's now the distillery property that says Buffalo Trace, and they're like, "Well, that's kind of a cool name. We should go with that." And so that's how we get the name Buffalo Trace on this property. Initially was a survey map from the late 1800s, and it was literally just the people saying, "Hey, all the millions of buffalo cross here, and they've left a mark. It's a really easy place to cross the river." So uh, Leestown was set up in the late 1700s. It was kind of operating there for a while, and then we get into the late 1800s. And at this time, or into the mid 1800s, at this time, late 1700s through the mid 1800s, distilling wasn't so much something that was for fun and like, oh, let's go have a drink. We need to make some whiskey. It was kind of a necessity. Almost everyone who was living in North America at the time was in some sort of agriculture. And when you were in agriculture, if you were growing products, you needed, out of necessity, some way to store your product or to hold value for your product after it had been fresh and like kind of in season. So if you were growing some sort of fruit, whether it was apples, pears, peaches, once you had bought or sold or traded what you could when it was fresh, you weren't going to let it just sit and rot on your shelf. You would turn it into some sort of shelf stable item, whether that was a preserve, a jam, something like that, or you could turn it into a cider, a brandy, some sort of alcohol where it would still be shelf stable and it would still have some value for you later on. You would do the same thing if you had grains. If you were growing wheat or rye or corn, once you had done what you could with it while it was fresh, you wanted to hold some value, not just sit and watch it rot. And you would distill that into a whiskey. And that's what was happening in this Leestown area. They were growing grains and then they were distilling it into whiskey once they had done what they could with it while it was fresh. And so that's kind of where we're at when we're in the 1700s into the 1800s. And then we start getting more commercial distilling. We go through the Industrial Revolution and it makes commercial operations a lot more efficient and effective for everyone. So we have Colonel E.H. Taylor which EH stands for Edmund Haynes. So Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. He purchases the distillery about 1870s, and he christens it OFC, which is a reference to his belief that all of the finest whiskey is going to come from old fashioned wood fired copper stills. And he wanted everyone to know he was doing everything the absolute best. And he was going to use most expensive equipment to make sure it was the best and make sure he had the best product. But if he was going to do that, you needed to know the only thing his whiskey touched was copper. And with that, it took a lot of money and a lot of investment. So Colonel E.H. Taylor is a Kentucky colonel. That can be confusing for those of you who have not been to Kentucky or you're not as familiar with it, but it's an honorific that you can earn here in the state. And it was not something that was bestowed upon him for any kind of military service. A Kentucky colonel is someone who has done something significant for the Commonwealth. The state of Kentucky is a Commonwealth. And then they have to be nominated by a sitting Kentucky colonel. That kind of makes its way over to the governor. If the governor kind of agrees with what's written, thinks it is worthy of becoming a colonel, they bestow that title upon you. It doesn't come with any power. You're not leading any men. It doesn't come with any money. It essentially comes with a piece of paper that says, "Congratulations, you're a colonel." And then if you live here, you can also get a license plate that says you're a colonel as well. It is a really big honor. But just kind of to clarify, Colonel E.H. Taylor was not a military colonel. He was a Kentucky colonel. Another Kentucky colonel that some of you guys might be aware of is going to be Colonel Sanders from KFC. He's a Kentucky colonel. Dolly Parton is also one of our newer Kentucky colonels. So not necessarily military service, but still a really big honor. So E.H. Taylor buys this property. He starts retrofitting and putting in kind of state of the art, top of the line equipment all the way through. And it takes a big investment to do that. And as he's building this new distillery, everything's up and running. There ends up being a fire on the distillery, and essentially like wipes out all of his hard work and money that he had put into this. At that point, he needs some help, and he needs to bring in more money. So at that point, he brings on George T. Stagg. And so Colonel Taylor's still involved with the distillery at that point, but you have Stagg, who is the primary owner, while Taylor is kind of running operations. There's another big expansion as we get this like new influx of money. There's they're making a great product. People are aware of like the OFC brand, but you still have two people who see the world very differently with Stagg and Taylor, and it ends up causing some problems and some disagreements. Eventually, Colonel Taylor leaves the distillery. Stagg stays on. Colonel Taylor started another distillery in the area just outside of Frankfurt in a small town called Millville. And then as Stagg's running the distillery, eventually a young man about 15, 16 years old named Albert B. Blanton joins the company as just kind of an office boy, which is kind of like the bottom of the barrel. He was your assistant who was just kind of the gopher. Go get this, go get that. Just do whatever we need so that things go right. And Albert Blanton works his way up from that position all the way to a point where he is the president of the distillery. And when he takes over the distillery, not too long afterwards, um, Albert Blanton is running a distillery right in the midst of Americans' Prohibition. So he had the foresight to kind of see this was coming, make sure that they were going to be in a position to continue operating. So with Blanton's foresight, they were able to continue operating and distilling on the site even through Prohibition. And along his career, he starts mentoring a young man named Elmer T. Lee. And Elmer T. Lee, um, he started at a lower position, just like Blanton, and kind of worked his way up until when Blanton retires, he ends up running the distillery. Um, and these are all people, all the ones that we've discussed so far are people who were instrumental in the success of Buffalo Trace. They were instrumental in the success of bourbon, and they've all end up having bourbons named after them. Um, so Blanton's is obviously one of the more collectible and well-known bourbons out there. Stag is a really sought after bourbon. E.H. Taylor Jr., whether it's their bourbon, their rye, very sought after products. And so these were kind of people who were on the Mount Rushmore of bourbon. And they all were just kind of one after another at this distillery. And part of that is why Buffalo Trace was able to have success throughout all these years, and why they are still the longest continuously operating distillery in America, as well as why it's the most awarded distillery and why we know all of their products so well. So Elmer T. Lee is running the distillery through the 1980s. And as I mentioned, like Blanton's is a product that we're all pretty familiar with that iconic horse on top. He created that product, and it was the first single barrel product in the bourbon world. So before that, everything was a blend. And a blend just means more than one barrel is used and mixed together in order to get that final product that you're going to have in your bottle at the end. Rather than a single barrel, means it just comes from one barrel, everything that's going to be in your bottle. Um, so we've touched on a little bit of Buffalo Trace's history, kind of all the way through. Um, we've also touched on some of their big brands and some of the importance that they've had. But now I think would be a really good time for us to talk about what's right across the street in J. Mattingly. So, J. Mattingly, 1845, is quite literally right across the street from the Buffalo Trace Distillery. And while it is a newer distillery, it does have a really old lineage, and you can kind of see that in their branding with their name of 1845. So the Mattingly family is one of the oldest families that you'll see in like Kentucky history books as well as in distilling history. They have a documented distilling heritage that begins way back in 1845. And so over the generations, members of the Mattingly family have helped start or run several distilleries around the state. Uh, and some of them even played roles in brands like Maker's Mark, Barton, and many others. And the modern revival of the name comes from Jeff Mattingly. And Jeff Mattingly started by blending and crafting bourbons in small batches, really focusing on like being innovative with what he was doing, trying to stand out. And they really approached it with a lot of customization. They pioneered this unique finishing process that it's called double stage. So it gives new life and new flavor to barrels that are already there, and it gives everything its own kind of unique identity. Their distillery and their tasting room are really cool. Their tasting is called the Magnificent Seven. You get to taste seven different products of theirs, and it's always rotating because they do everything in such a small batch. You you're almost never going to be there and have the same tasting that you did before. I mentioned they have their Bourbon 30 products. Um, those are going to be pretty consistent. You'll pretty much always have that in your tasting. But other than that, they have seasonal releases. They have single barrel releases. They always have something different that they're pouring, and you're going to get to have in their tasting. And then they have really cool experiences like they have a cigar pairing where they have a little like cigar smoking lounge kind of built on a deck behind the property. They have they have this really unique blending experience, and that's where Poor Decisions comes from. So with their blending experience, you can create your own custom blend from all these barrels that they have down in their production area. You get to taste them and say, give me, 30% from this barrel, 40% from this barrel, and 30% from that barrel. And they mix it all together, and you're like, oh, that's great. Let me see if we changed instead of 30% from that barrel, 20% from that one, and 10% from that one. And you change it up a little bit, try that. Once you find that one that like speaks to you, that one that is uniquely you, they bottle it up for you. And that's what I've got here with Poor Decisions. So we went with some friends and some team members, and we did that experience. It's super unique, super special. Blending is kind of getting its day in the sun right now. So there was a long time where after Blanton's came around and everyone really focused on single barrels, people paid a real premium for a single barrel product, and it is a unique product. Anytime you have something that's a single barrel, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's a better product just because it's a single barrel. So things that are blended can highlight the notes that you want to get out, or that taste best to you, or it can also hide the notes that are off for you. And that's what's really cool about blending is you can kind of emphasize or cover up some of the notes that you either like or dislike. So th- that's really my highlight on J. Mattingly 1845. It is a awesome facility. They have several different brands they have put out. They always have something new on the shelf. Their experiences are really second to none, and their staff and their people are incredible. So if you're in the Frankfurt area, I'm positive you're going to be swinging by Buffalo Trace. It is one of the biggest names in the industry. They provide outstanding products and outstanding experiences, but you should really take the time, go right across the street, and check out J. Mattingly 1845. You will not be disappointed, and you'll have such a unique experience when you're there. It really does feel like you become part of the family when you're there. So that's going to be today's episode. If you have any questions, feel free, shoot us an email, drop us a comment. Always looking to help out. But until then, keep sipping.